Hello, everyone. To start off this week's set of videos, we're going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite topics, which is emotional experience. Now, in some ways, this is a topic that probably needs very little introduction. On some level, we all know what emotions are. For instance, if you look at this woman, you'd be able to quickly identify that she is experiencing a moment of joy. You can probably quickly remember times when you yourself were feeling a similar emotion. You might be able to infer some of the situations that could have led to this woman's enjoyment and satisfaction. So, do we all intuitively have a really strong sense of what characterizes an emotion? Well, yes. But when you look at the actual science and theory behind emotion, the story gets a little bit more complicated. There actually are some areas of controversy and disagreement. Now, for most of you, when you think about an emotional experience, you're probably imagining something kind of like the inside-out model of emotions. This might imply, I'm sure many of you have seen this movie, for those of you who don't, in this movie, you get to go inside someone's kind of psychological experience of emotion and see that inside the protagonist's brain, there are different characters, different sort of centers or nodes that are responsible for each of the primary types of emotion that she feels as she goes throughout her life. There is a part of her brain that is responsible for her happiness, and there's a part of her brain that is responsible for her fear, part of her brain responsible for her anguish, for her anger, for her disgust. And so these layers of her emotional experience are quite separate. At the same time, there's not really much intermediate activity between experiencing some kind of emotional producing situation and having that fully fledged emotional experience triggered, right? A sadness inducing situation immediately causes the sadness part of her brain to go into a full blown meltdown. Now, this is what we would call an example of a basic emotions theory. And as it happens, some basic emotions theorists were responsible for acting as scientific consultants when making Inside Out. And this is a theory that's basically assuming that emotions are like a reflex. They are very evolutionarily deep, they are very biologically primitive, and once an emotion is triggered, it happens kind of reflexively. There's not a lot you can do to control it. We are actually going to be focusing on a theory today that takes a slightly different approach. We're going to be focusing on the appraisal framework of emotions. And here, instead of seeing them as so biologically basic, instead of seeing them as so reflexive or automatic, we're going to see emotions as involving a little bit more of a process of interpretation. So, what this means is there is not always a direct link between a situation and the emotion that you feel. There is at least one step in between, and that is you're making sense of the situation and how it affects you. Psychologists call this an appraisal. So let's say you're in a situation that would cause most of us to feel fear. You're hanging out at your house, and outside the picture window or through the glass door, you see a shadowy figure. Maybe it looks like an adult male, maybe it looks like someone with a mask on. This is terrifying, right? This is so scary. But it's not necessarily scary because, you just see that visual image and that visual image irreducibly links to the emotional experience. It's scary because your brain is interpreting what that means for you. You're thinking, you're quickly, subconsciously processing, this is the kind of situation that could lead to damage, harm. Uh-oh, my life's in danger. And that interpretation, the uh-oh, this could really be damaging to me, this is surprising, this is unexpected, this could be damaging to me, that's what leads to the feeling of terror. And what's really interesting about this, why we would even bring up this point in this lecture, is because that little interpretive step opens up a lot of room for individual differences in emotional experience. This is kind of like that social cognitive perspective. There is dynamic interpretation happening, and that can be different based on your past life experiences, based on your personality, based on your culture. So when we talk about appraisals, there's a couple of different layers that tend to be really important. The main appraisal, the very first thing that happens, is figuring out whether the situation is good for you or bad for you. This is kind of like the broad pleasure versus pain, pleasure versus displeasure spectrum that you might feel in an emotion. So when emotions feel like they could be beneficial, when situations feel like they could be beneficial, you're likely to feel some kind of pleasure. If a situation feels like it's mostly harmful or could involve loss, that's probably going to trigger a negative feeling emotion. But we all know that even within the world of positive emotions or negative emotions, there's different flavors, right? Sadness is different than anger, which is different than fear. And these distinctions are reliant on what we call secondary appraisals. So things like who's to blame. You could experience a major loss, right? Let's say something that really feels like it's not good for you, you get a terrible grade on an exam. There could be some situations where you pretty much feel like you only have yourself to blame. And in that case, you might feel guilt or sadness or disappointment. But there could be situations where you feel like someone else is to blame. Maybe you couldn't study for your OChem exam because your roommate was blasting death metal music until 3 in the morning. And in that case, you'd likely feel anger and frustration. Emotions also depend on the degree of certainty we feel about situations. Do I totally have this figured out? Do I know exactly how things are going to proceed from here? Or is there still a degree of uncertainty? So let's talk about a positive situation. You could either know for sure that you have won an award at a science fair, in which case you'd probably feel joy, happiness, pride. Or you could think there's a good chance you'll win that award, but you might not be certain, in which case you might feel anticipation or hopefulness. And finally, your degree of sensation that you have control. And your negative emotions are likely to be even more negative to the extent that you feel like there's really nothing you can do in this situation. Not only were you not responsible, but from this point forward, there's nothing you can do to control things. Your emotions are likely to be more energized and kind of positive and healthy if you feel like you have some degree of control in a situation. And we can see these different ingredients blending together in different combinations, kind of like a recipe, to produce different typical emotions. Again, a positive goal-congruent situation where there's not anybody in particular to blame, but it's actually about a situation, and where you're not completely certain of the outcome, this would lead to hope. If there's a situation that seems mostly bad for you, but again, there's no one to blame, and it's really set in stone, it's very certain, this is going to lead to sorrow, grief, or despair. So let's test your intuitions for a quick second. If there is a situation that seems goal incongruent, so it's not good for you, you feel like you are to blame for this state of affairs, and you feel like you could have controlled what happened, how would you be most likely to feel? So once you have that guess in your head, we would, as emotion theorists, probably predict that you could feel regret, maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe some self-directed anger. So you should have self-directed negative emotions. Now, what about a case where there's an emotion that is goal congruent? You again feel like you're the one to blame, and you feel like you had control over how things, or you're the one who's responsible, and you feel like you were controlling how things unfolded. What should you feel? And emotion theorists would probably predict, I think my head is blocking this text right now, but you would feel confident or prideful, right? So this is appraisal theory in a nutshell. We have all of these layers of interpretations we can make about different situations. They combine together like the ingredients in a recipe to create particular categories of an emotional experience. And so why does this matter? Well, we've already touched on this just a teensy bit. This implies that we can't always predict a person's emotional state just from knowing the situation they're in. We also have to know how they interpret their situation. Two students who both get a failing grade on an exam could walk away thinking about it very differently and feeling very differently, depending on who they think is to blame, right? Depending on whether they think they can control how things will go in the future. This also implies, and we'll be getting into this in the next video, that we have at least a tiny bit of control over our feelings. Because while our initial appraisals might be pretty automatic, you can come in and adjust those interpretations. You can reappraise and walk away with a different feeling about the situations you encounter.